Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming here today. My name is Norman Villarina. I'm with Industry Capital. I'm class of 95. We're here for the session on global development of renewable energy, as you know. I just want to share a couple of stats with you for many of you guys that don't follow the energy sector. 80% of all energy today pretty much comes from fossil fuels. 10% from biofuels, 5% from solar, and 5% from nuclear. This group of panelists today are going to be talking about how what they're doing specifically as it relates to developing renewable assets on a global basis. We have some people focused mostly on Western markets, and then we have a gentleman from the oil and gas sector who's telling you what he's doing on a global basis as well. I'm also delighted to introduce Professor Geoff Heel, Donald C. Waite, Professor of Social Enterprise and Bernstein Faculty Leader at the Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics. Professor Heel is noted for his contributions to economic theory and resource environmental economics. He's author of 18 books and about 200 articles. Professor Heel is a fellow of Econometric Society, past president of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, and recipient of the 2013 Best Publication Prize of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, just to name a few of his accomplishments. You can read more about him in the conference program that you guys all have. And now I'll hand the floor over to Professor Heel.
My pleasure to introduce the panelists. We've got a great panel drawing on the enormous depth of our alumni. We don't think of Columbia as perhaps as a renewable energy school, but we actually have a remarkable diversity of alumni in various aspects of renewable energy. We've been able to use that to assemble a really great panel. So on my left is Philip Hansteen. Philip works for Equinor. And in case you don't recognize Equinor, it used to be known as Statoil. It's a Norwegian national oil company. It is primarily, obviously, an oil and gas player and a major one, but it also is increasingly a major player in the offshore wind field. And Philip will be focusing a bit on that. Next to him, we've got Assaad Razzouk, who's the CEO of Sindicatum Renewable Energy, which is a Singapore-based renewable energy operation, providing renewable energy resources in Southeast Asia. After that, we've got Miguel Salís, who's the founder and chairman of Renovables. Before that, he was a founder and the CEO of Aeolia Renewables. So he's a major player in the Spanish renewable energy field. And then Toni Volpe, who used to work for Eni and is now the chief executive of Falck Renewables, and again is a major player in renewables in Italy and throughout Europe and in North America. So we've got a great panel. The format is that each of the panelists will talk for a few minutes explaining what their company is doing in this space and the way they see the space. And then after that, I'll direct some questions at them, try to get a discussion going. And then after that, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So without further ado, Philip, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. Are people energized? Yes? Good. Because if not, you'll be energized after this. When I woke up this morning, I flipped the switch, and the light came on. And it's probably the same for most of you. But globally, there's 1.2 billion people who don't have access to energy. And that's one of the reasons I work in the industry. And I, from Norway to Nigeria, to help people get energy. A bit of my background there. As Geoff alluded to, I work for Equinor, former Statoil. We're a global oil and gas company, but we have turned into a global energy company in this transition. So we're in 36 different countries. We produce a bit north of 2 million barrels per day. That equivalents to giving energy to 170 million people every day. But as I said, we changed into an energy company, and we did this because there was a huge transition in the energy industry. And we shaped a new vision that we want to shape the future of energy. So how are we doing this? Among the things we're doing is that we are creating low-carbon alternatives for energy. And for us, that is basically capitalizing on the deep knowledge we have for 4 decades as one of the largest offshore oil and gas players. So we're transferring that to offshore wind. And today our portfolio is mostly in Europe with our offshore wind. In the UK, we produce 750 megawatts of wind from offshore, which is very different than the rest of the panelists here. And that gives approximately energy to 650,000 people. We have more projects in the pipeline. So when a new project we have in Germany coming on stream later this year, we'll add another capacity. So actually we're producing electricity for 1 million people. And we have a project down the road, actually in New York, outside of Long Island. We have Empire Wind, which is going to be a huge opportunity, I think, for US and especially New York region. But also we have projects in looking at California, we're looking at Japan as growing markets. But capitalizing on what we know already in offshore technology, you know, the heavy lifting offshore, looking at what's on basically the subsurface is important for us to do that. So I'll end with that. And
Great, thanks, Philip.
Yeah.
Assaad, kick off.
Thank you, Geoff. Hi, my name is Assaad Razzouk. I want to start with quite a seminal report that was published last Monday. I don't know how many of you had a chance to flip through it, but it was the IPCC report on climate change that basically concluded that we have 12 years before extreme weather basically goes apocalypse now. And the solution, or one of the primary solutions to avoiding that, is to go 100% renewables as soon as possible. Now, we are a small renewable energy firm that's developing assets in India, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia. So a combined population of 2 billion people, but probably more importantly, a population that is that's at the forefront of suffering from climate change. And we see the impact on a daily basis, really, in our work with extreme weather features all over the place. The issues that we face, I think, are going to be familiar to a lot of people in this room. They're mostly myth. So we navigate in a world where myths are being propagated by industries that are capitalized and have been very rich for over 100 years. So, you know, for example, there's a prevalent myth that renewable energy is subsidized. In fact, it's subsidized to a fraction of oil, gas, and coal. 1/8, I think, on a cash basis, and less than 5% on an all-in basis. There's another myth that coal is needed to alleviate energy poverty, when we all know that for 100 years, they still didn't get there, and we have, as Philip said, 1.2 billion people still without power around the world. Even the International Energy Agency acknowledges that we can alleviate poverty 4 times faster because we're cheaper and we're much, much faster. You know, etc. So we navigate in a world of myth. It's very difficult to do business on a day-to-day basis, despite everything that you hear about renewables, and despite the fact that it's becoming an existential effort, so to speak, or at least that's what the majority of the world's scientists say. So I'll stop there. Great. For now.
Well, thanks for that very sort of salutary introduction. Miguel, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Miguel Salís. I will mostly talk about Spain, so not so much a global perspective, but an important market for renewables. I started investing in renewable energy in 1996, over 21 years ago. So it's been a long period. I started as an angel investor, investing in small wind development projects in Spain. At the time, the industry was non-existent or at its infancy, very heavily regulated, very heavily supported, and completely off the radar screen of the big companies. Between 1996 and 2006, that was sort of the pattern, even in a country like Spain, which has been a pioneer in the development of renewables. with ups and downs, so as I will mention later. Between 2006 and 2014, we entered into a second phase. I actively participated in that phase by founding and managing Eolia, which was a primarily wind, also solar PV energy company, which went from 0 to 600 megawatts of wind and 60 megawatts of solar PV in a period of 8 years, which made us the largest independent wind energy company in Spain. Over that period, regulation became more stable. The big guys started to enter the industry, particularly in Spain. The big utilities, Iberdrola, Acciona, became very, very active in buying assets and participating in the industry. And in 2014, Eolia was sold to Oaktree, one of the large global investment funds. That was the second phase. The third phase, which is the one I'm in now, I founded a company called Kira Renovables last year. We are developing 500 megawatts of solar PV utility-scale projects in Spain, completely without any form of regulatory support. That's very, very important. I think that's one theme which I think will come up. Renewables are cost-efficient today compared to oil and gas, to coal, to gas, to nuclear. And that is a fact, and that's what makes me believe that the industry will grow very, very rapidly over the next 10 years. We'll probably not get where we all want to get, but I think the industry is going to grow exponentially over the next couple of years. Just some final words on Spain. Spain has had a little bit of everything. We were pioneers. Some of the largest wind and solar PV companies globally are Spanish because of that. We had a very stable regulatory environment. We committed excesses. At one point, the level of regulatory support, the subsidies, was such that the electricity sector in Spain was about to go bankrupt. That explains why there was a very significant reduction in support, which again, which led to we went from being global leaders between 2008 and 2012 to basically, building nothing between 2012 and today. Hopefully that's going to change now, and I think that's basically what I want to say.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, Miguel. Toni.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's indeed a pleasure to be here. Falck Renewables is a very similar size, company in size to Assaad, and it's about 1,000 megawatts, operating assets mainly in Europe and the United States. We also are building new wind farms in Norway and Sweden. We're present in the UK, Italy, France, and Spain. So we are a developer and owner of wind and solar projects, assets. We also do a third-party asset management service. And actually, I found out today that I have the pleasure to service one of the assets he has in Spain. The point I wanted to make is that renewable energy has done very, very well in the past 20 years. And there is a degree of change in certain continents, like Europe, for example, that probably was very difficult to forecast 15 years ago. I mean, just to give an example, renewable energy has gone from 0% in year 2000 or 1% in year 2000 in Europe to 17% in 2017. That's a 1% every year. That's a big change for a region that uses 3,000 terawatt-hours of electricity. In the past 10 years, to give you other examples, solar grew 44 times in Europe. Wind grew 4 times. The impact of renewable energy in transportation went from 2-3% to 7% in the past 10 years. So I completely agree that there's a lot to do, and of course the news coming from the IPCC are alarming, but a lot has been done. Now, the problem with the growth of the past 10 years in Europe was that it came at a cost. It was subsidized, for the most part in Europe. So Europeans had to pay a bill of depending how you calculate, but let's say 70, 80 billion euros on their bills to fuel this growth. So there was an enormous attraction for capital. So capital was not the problem and is not the problem, but it came at a cost. The reason why I'm very optimistic about the future of renewable energy and the real possibilities to decarbonize the world, so I'm not sure whether or not we will reach the targets of 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 or not, but I think for sure there will be another tremendous change in the way we generate energy, is because from this point on, renewable energy can be built without any forms of subsidy. So it has reached a point in terms of cost, pure cost, where it's completely on the same level of fossil energy. And this is true in most of the countries globally, and I think it's true in Europe as well. And so not only makes sense for a buyer to buy renewable, not because it's clean, but because it's basically competitive with fossil fuel. But also it has another feature, which I think it's not yet very well understood, but it will have profound changes on the economies of other industry, which is renewable energy can offer one thing that fossil fuel cannot offer, which is price stability over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. So for a renewable power plant, it's absolutely fine to provide a price of the energy up to 30 years. I can give you a fixed price for 30 years if I want. That's absolutely doable because I do not depend on commodities. So, to me, it's completely irrelevant to forecast what will be the price of oil and gas 20, 30 years from now. Yes, I need to balance power because it is an intermittent source, but that's a small fraction of the cost. So this is not only good for a developer, for an owner, because when you have a price which is fixed, you can finance more efficiently your power plants, your projects, and recycle equity and put it in more projects. So the leverage effect grows and the growth rate also increases. But it's also is very, very important also for buyers of power, because they take out of the equation the risk of the volatility of commodities. And we know that commodities are decided by outside sometimes of the economic systems in which you operate, by OPEC, Russia, United States, and so on. This is so well understood that certain companies like aluminum company, now if there is an energy-intensive industry which pays a lot of attention to the electricity price, is aluminum, because for aluminum it's 60-70%, so 50-60% of the total production cost. Now, aluminum companies in Norway are going for long-term 29-year contracts, I hear, renewable power, with a price which is very predictable. So that means that A, it's competitive, otherwise they would risk to be out of the market. B, it means that also they appreciate the predictability of the price. So for these reasons, my argument is, the best is yet to come, because this is going to become a world which was heavily incentivized on the production side, so something that is very competitive and driven by demand. And when you see a market which is driven fundamentally by demand, that's when you see the big change.
So thanks very much, guys. So what you've heard is that renewable energy really has gone through a major transition in the last 5 or 10 years, last 5 years, really, probably. And it's gone from being dependent on government subsidies back in the early 2000s to being highly cost competitive these days. And then having some other advantages as well, as Toni was emphasizing. It's independent of commodity prices. You can lock in prices, competitive prices for many years. And that's obviously a very attractive feature for the buyer. It's also, incidentally, something that nobody mentioned, relatively easy to build a renewable power station. And if you want to build a coal-fired power station, it can take you 5 to 10 years. If you want to put up a solar power station, you can do it in a year or so. So the cost of financing and so on are very much less. A couple of you mentioned the recent IPCC report, which came out, an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, came out on Monday, emphasizing the need for rapid action in the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and saying that the world really needs to move away from fossil fuels by sort of the order of 2040, which is a very, very ambitious target, obviously. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists to comment on whether you think that is an achievable target, and perhaps more relevantly, what do you think are the principal obstacles to achieving that target? You know, how would the world have to change if we were actually to get somewhere near what the IPCC is setting out as the desideratum here? Philip.
Yeah, I think, first of all, the report is a bit shocking for many people, of course. But I think it sends the signal it should. And, you know, this, for us at least, and I think the oil and gas industry in general, is that, you know, business as usual is not an option. You know, we need to change. And, you know, we, as a company, we transform this, you know, to low carbon. So we want to be the most efficient oil and gas producer for carbon. And I'm just want to put it in perspective that Equinor produces oil per barrel emissions of roughly 8 kilos per barrel. You know, the industry standard is almost at 17. So I think that's one of the initiatives you need to look at to go there. I mean, one thing is power, and power, if you look at energy, you know, we have power for lighting and such, you have heating, but transportation. And, you know, there's a long time to, even though batteries are really, you know, come along far, and we even have installed a 1 megawatt battery at one of our offshore wind facilities. And we can get back to that. But I think when it comes to meeting the demand, I think we have to look at more than just power. We have to look at the whole value chain of energy. You know, and in Equinor, we're in the Alliance of Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, together with most of the global oil and gas companies, except the Americans, ironically. And, you know, we are working constantly with innovative ideas, for example, on carbon capture and storage, and other ways to detect basic CO2 emissions. And again, believe it or not, a lot of the emissions are coming from leakages in methane, for example. So we can do a lot in the different places than just on the consumer side, and that's what we are pushing for in Equinor. Correct.
Yeah.
Professor Hill, can I just say first that I think the school should try and do much better on these manuals. I mentioned that to you before. This is the second one that I've attended today, and I'm sure that our school alumni can staff, you know, a slightly different looking one. Now, on the issue,
totally agree.
On the issue of the IPCC report, first of all, I disagree with everything Philip said. Okay, just to be clear.
I knew about this before the session. So.
And the reason I do is because it doesn't matter whether we can achieve the trajectory or not. What matters is that every degree that we can fight is going to improve the lives of hundreds of millions. So 1.5 is better than 2, but 2 is better than 2.5, and 2.5 is better than 3. And so as a result, you know, whether we can achieve the trajectory is not important. What's important is that the message be accepted by a world which is very important to the school, which I think has got all the levers to change things, but is doing zero about it, which is the international capital markets.
Yeah.
So the combined power of stocks, bonds, and loans is doing almost nothing on this topic. People are happily investing, focused on their quarterly profits. It's the short-term carry or, you know, whatever it is that's motivating everybody. And frankly, the entire system is not adaptable to what we're doing. So what we have to do, to give you just one critical lever, is we have to make money incredibly expensive for Statoil and everybody else in the oil and gas and the coal industry so that we stop future investments. I mean, Australia just this week, 3 days after the IPCC report, you know, is threatening to deploy billions into new coal plants. I mean, that's just completely mad. Yeah. And the reason for that is because the international capital markets simply don't care. So what we need is we need the insurance companies to stop insuring business consequences of investing in oil, gas, and coal, and I do say oil as well. We need the accountants to stop writing, you know, soporific reports that put everybody to sleep and don't touch on climate risks. We need a carbon price, obviously, globally. Yeah. We also need litigation. We've got to sue absolutely everybody. And we have to change the definition of fiduciary duty to include paying attention to what's going to happen to your kids and grandkids, which the entire capital markets construct today, frankly, just doesn't care about. And I'm being polite, but I'll stop there.
Well, that's an interesting set of comments. Thanks very much. Yeah. I mean, I think actually there are a number of investors, probably not enough, but some investors who are beginning to take your attitude. I mean, quite a lot of big pension funds are now trying not to invest in fossil fuels. And Colombia's had a big debate, actually, about whether its endowment should be invested in fossil fuels or not, as a result of which it's decided not to invest in thermal coal and maybe withdrawing some other fossil fuels as well. But anyway, we'll get back to these points perhaps later on. Miguel, well, let's get your take on the issue, the obstacles.
I don't think there's much more left to say. I think you've covered pretty much everything. So let me just highlight one aspect, which I think is understated and critical, which is small household residential electricity generation via solar PV panels, which is a reality. It's cost efficient. Any household in a developed or less developed economy can effectively build solar PV plants with a storage system, battery system, and amortize that over a period of whatever, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, depending on the cost of electricity of each country. That is something which is sort of to create incremental supply of renewables at the bottom-up level, which is very important. Some countries have some governments have gone the exactly other way around and have been sort of de-emphasizing or putting barriers or putting taxes, complicating the ability of small households to build solar PV panels with storage. I think it's critical that all governments not only put problems, but help develop and support an initiative like this.
Right. Thanks. Tony, what do you see as the obstacles? What do we have to deal with to get this happening?
Well, a couple of comments. First of all, the report is important, but like any long-term projection, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. I mean, what's going to happen by 2050? Picture ourselves in 1986. If we had to predict what would happen in 2018, which is the same time, 32 years, what would we guess right? Probably very little. The point also is that technology is changing so fast, and it's every technological cycle is accelerating, that I think most of these reports cannot capture the technological evolution that you will see over the next years, which is going to also provide upsides, quite frankly. It's going to provide better technologies that we don't think exist today. I mean, who would have thought, for example, that the impact of digitalization on our industry would be capable of producing in O&M expenses reduction by 10-15%. So I maintain a very good degree of optimism on the sense that, yes, things are not progressing as we hoped, and actually are going worse than. But I think that if governments, and this is the answer, I think, you need governments to be absolutely convinced that they need to address the issue of carbon emissions, generally speaking. The economics, again, of most of the industry are already there without incentives. Mm-hmm. And what government should do, which is very similar to what as I was saying before, is they need to think about their fiscal policy and how can they rebalance fiscal policy across sectors. So we have to stop looking only at power generation. Power generation is already there. It's very developed. There's a lot of change already has happened, and a lot more will happen. Transportation, heating and cooling are where most of the emissions are and are way behind power generation. And there's a way to rebalance, and I'll give you practical examples. You were saying, well, transportation, we have to wait a long time before batteries become compatible, blah, blah, blah. True on the commercial side, although you might see the development of hydrogen in the next years. But on the residential side, you can accelerate as a government electrification of transportation, for example, with taxes, by closing, as many cities in Europe are doing, diesel to large, in terms of access to large cities. You can stop subsidizing the demand side on diesel. In Italy, for example, I think there are 6 or 7 billion that are given in tax breaks on diesel fuel. If you remove that, you make electric cars more competitive. So I think the two things. So government are key. Their determination it's fundamental, and they have the levers to be able to rebalance sectors and push demand to us for more clean energy in all sectors: transportation, heating and cooling, and power generation. So that's a key role.
Philip, you indicated you wanted to just come back into this conversation.
I was trying to think how I can come with a comeback, because I see how the audience really, where you stand. And I don't think you disagree with everything, because I think that through the oil and gas industry, we have been able to develop technologies to more deploy renewable energies better, quicker, and at scale. I think that offshore wind, as most of you know, 2/3 of the globe is oceans. Putting up offshore wind is, and I think I can probably speak on behalf of everyone in the room, you would rather have a windmill 20 miles offshore than in your backyard. And I think what we are trying to do is capitalize on that. And we have developed what we call a floating offshore wind, where we can put anywhere. Because, normal traditional offshore wind, you have to put down on the surface, and there's limitations. There's where the 50 meters is the depth, is the maximum depth. So we are now deploying floating offshore wind, and you couldn't have done that without the oil and gas background and access to capital to do that. And I don't disagree with you that we need to put stricter, and I think price on carbon is fundamentally one of the reasons we have to kind of put in place. Because right now, there's no globally system for that. But I think, a lot of people are kind of looking at renewable energy as this, holy grail for emissions. And, for power, yes, I understand completely. And coal is I agree. We are a big natural gas company as well. We're providing 40% of all natural gas to UK, for example. And, we are doing that together with our renewable energy, basically. Together, because as some of you said, renewables is still intermittent. So if you don't have wind when people want to heat or cool their houses, what do? You have to have a backup, and at least gas is our preferred partner for that. But I try to get a bit away from this holy grail for renewable energy. We'll do everything, at least in the short term. That's what I'm trying to go into, please.
Okay, so let me just ask you guys one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Time is going surprisingly rapidly. Do you think that in parts of the US there are really problems with the way that sort of power markets are behaving, particularly California? There's a huge surge of renewable energy hitting the marketplace, sort of somewhere between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m., pushing spot prices right down. And so the return on renewable energy actually is falling because of the markets are being saturated. Germany has had the same problem too. A lot of utilities are having major problems because of the a lot of people owning conventional power plants having major problems because of the very low spot prices for a big part of the day. Is this an issue? Do we need to rethink the structure of power markets in order to accommodate renewables? Let's start from the other end. And Toni, you want to give us your input on this one?
Well, as you might expect, my answer is going to be yes. Look, power markets are a funny thing. They were built for fossil fuels, for electricity generated by fossil fuel, and they were never built for markets where renewables would be, 50, 20, 25. Europe is going to, 50%. So you clearly need to change that, because you are basically pricing two very different things with the same price. I mean, as I mentioned before, electricity is, from renewables, first of all, it's clean, but second, it has an industrial cost that goes down because the technology costs go down. Windmills and solar PV cost less and less every year. And it has this feature that is not based on fuel. It is basically a predictable price long term. Yet you're trying to price that, and that's how power markets work, with the same price that is a commodity plus structure typical of the fossil fuel. So it's like mixing oil and water. They don't mix. They're two separate commodities. The problem is that today you don't have two separate prices, but that's what you should have. Imagine a world where people could choose to pay the as available power, so the power that is there when it's available, not when you need it, a certain price, of course cheaper, and then the on-demand price, so the so the power that is there when you need it, coming from fossil fuel, most of it, much higher price, because it's a different resource. You would have a massive behavioral change, right? Because you have the right price incentive for people to do the right thing. You would have a massive development of storage, because you would arbitrage between these two prices. Right. So that is, I think, where the world of power market design is going. You need to come up with a way to price these two things differently. And then, of course, there are all the environmental aspects, carbons, and so on. Long-term power pricing is a way to effectively achieve that, because you are creating, sort of a longer-term, lower price for renewables. But you need to be a little bit more ambitious. And that's where, again, I go back to the role of governments and regulators, because they need to picture the future market design that addresses a renewable penetration of 25, 30% or more in the market. So in Europe, going to a continental example, that responsibility stands on the European Commission and the DG Energy, which is the one in charge of picturing what this new market design will be. It will be the market design probably kicking in 2025 or maybe a little bit earlier. Not today. Today we can still work with what we have, but you need something like that. Again, I maintain the optimism, because I do think, having spoken to a lot of the people working at the Commission, that they do get it. They do see the changes. They do see this landslide of demand moving now into the sector and driving what they need, led by the Googles, the Amazons, and so on, which are the main players on the buying directly renewable power, but you will see others coming. And we will get to a future where you will finally see the correct pricing, so separate pricing for two very different kind of commodities.
Miguel, any comments?
Yep, I agree completely. I think, I couldn't have said it better. Just to add a few points, or to put things in a slightly different perspective, I think I'm optimistic, and I think the market will take care of itself. Long-term power purchase agreements are a reality. They're very small. They are at a very early stage of development, but one can see every day that there's things developing. Solar and wind have zero variable cost, and as such, they're perfect counterparties for long-term consumers, as Toni was saying earlier. So I think as the PPA market develops and becomes a larger share of the market, I think the effects of variability of production of solar and wind will be sort of less relevant. The other thing, I think we're all being optimistic here. I think the other thing which we really need to make substantial progress, and a lot has been made, but a lot still remains, is storage capacity, which is critical and has always been critical. When I was an engineering student, I still remember, that was the big challenge, and it still remains the big how to store energy. I think there's been huge development over the last 10, 15, 20 years, but a lot remains to do. Until we have proper storage, we will not be able to use clean electricity generation as baseload, dispatchable electricity, which is really what we don't have at this stage. And I think that's a key challenge going forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting technology being developed in that area, isn't there? But none of it is really obviously commercial at this point. I mean, large-scale flow batteries and so on. Some of the California utilities are installing 100-megawatt-hour batteries. Yeah. But again, they're all basically beta test versions rather than fully stable industrial strength versions. Yeah, I quite agree. I think that's, yes. Anyway, Assaad, how does this look from the Southeast Asian perspective? What, are the markets working well there, or you feel there's changes needed?
Look, first of all, renewable energy is not intermittent. Okay? So despite what you've heard, it's not intermittent. Okay. And I'm just going to pick up on a point Miguel made. I mean, yeah, the wind doesn't blow often at the same time as the sun is shining. We can also store things in hydro reservoirs, and we have storage batteries, plus we have waste to energy and other sources of renewables that combined are going to be just fine. In addition, if you think about a city, every electric car and charging point in a city is a moving power plant. It will suck power when it needs to, and it can give it back when it doesn't. And we park our cars, I think, 90% of the time, don't we? In
my case, it's probably 100%.
Yeah. So therefore, you know, this whole thing is a myth propagated by oil and gas companies that advertise in the tube and in museums and sponsor art exhibitions, and then they're at the airport and what have you. The problem is not this, you know, and it's the same with Southeast Asia, same anywhere. The problem is that you have inherent forces that are stopping change, and they're very powerful and they're very rich. And so you've got lobbying, and you've got capital markets, and you've got governments. The IPCC report is only 5 days old. Governments are totally AWOL. Investors, we haven't really heard much from them. Bankers are generally busy greenwashing. And, you know, the oil and gas companies are just laughing all the way to the bank. So the urgency, by the way, is also not coming out. This is actually urgent. This is not some issue that we can sit around and talk about again in 2 years at the next Columbia Business School, you know, Latin American by the time probably forum. So, and we have to be very careful with that. It will happen. We're deploying very fast. We've got to deploy faster. We've got to attack the points that are resisting that change, as I said, through the capital markets, insurance companies, accountancy, etc.
So I'm kind of reading you as saying that the economics is fine, it's the politics that we've got to fix when it comes to deploying renewable.
And the markets.
And the markets, okay, fine.
And the markets,
okay, so in that sense you're agreeing with the other two, yeah, right, okay.
Yeah.
Philip, give us a quick take on this.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think maybe now you'll agree with me, because you know what, right now, and you maybe heard this, days in Germany sometimes are totally renewable, 100%. You know, they have wind.
It's true in England, actually, too, believe it or not. Yeah.
Okay, yes, even better, because this what's happening now in Norway and Scandinavia is that there's power cables which are going to be going both ways, from UK to Norway, from Germany up to Norway. Yeah. And we heard a gentleman here talk about storage. And luckily for Norway, we are almost 100% hydro. So the goal of this, this can only be done if we work together. And I think this is where kind of California is, you know, there's 3 different markets really in California. But what we're trying to do in Scandinavia and North Pool is basically when there's so much power from Germany, they can push it up to Norway. We turn around turn in our reservoirs with hydro, and then we go vice versa. And I think that's must agree with. That's a good idea.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And what we're also doing is that we're actually electrifying our Norwegian continental shelf. So we're putting in offshore wind to power our oil and gas production. That must be also good for you, yeah?
No.
No?
Yeah, that's very bad.
No, it's not very bad.
You won't get him to agree on everything.
We'll take it offline, but I can continue.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, guys. We've got 15 minutes just over left, slightly less than I'd hoped. But anyway, let's have some questions. There's a lady over there raised her hand very promptly. Can someone get a mic to her?
Hi. So I get from what you all said, or almost all, that most of the problem is actually political. there's a lot that the governments have to do. And I'd say that mostly actually the US, because Europe is on the right track. There's a huge lobby of the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of money going around, and a lot of governments willing to accept it. What do you see within the renewable energy industry as a movement to coming together and actually organizing yourselves in order to be able to you won't be able, like the kind of money going around will never be comparable. So the kind of power that you have will never be comparable in the short run to the oil and gas industry, but at least to fight back in a way that pushes regulation or lowers like the kind of subsidies that the oil and gas industry gets.
Anybody want to take it, Toni?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say that my points on the impact of politics have to do with the speed of change, not with the fact that change is already happening. And I just want to make it absolutely clear, also the United States continues to be an absolutely attractive market for renewables, notwithstanding what has been done at federal level, because there are states within the United States that are actually pushing even further, California, for example, and others. So change is happening anyways. My point was, if you want to accelerate, then you need a bit more of an ambitious goal, if you want, or an ambitious goals, and also changes coming from government. Our industry is actually pretty good already, I think, at lobbying. I don't think the goal is really to try to put more money, because maybe you're right, we'll never have the same money than other industries. I think our industry needs to be realistic in making the economic case for what we're doing. So bring it to very simple terms and on a very simple economics basis. The lobbies were very effective. I mean, in the United States, when there was the tax reform, it would have been an absolute great opportunity to change the tax incentives to renewables, federal tax incentives. But I think the industry was able to convince the president that the impact of those, had he done that, then jobs would be lost, and and the economics of the entire country would suffer. So I do think it's effective. I think you have to work a little bit better in killing the myths, which you've mentioned a few, and bringing things to a more concrete, tangible way of what can be done and how much it costs, as simple as that. And now I think we are in a position to do it because, again, we are not dependent anymore on incentives. In the US, quite frankly, I think that if they remove the incentives, it'd be better, not because, but just because you would bring the industry to a level where it can compete without any kind of interference with government action, so to speak. So you would see the true price of renewables instead of a price which is helped by some kind of incentive.
Yeah.
No, but I'd like to make a the different point, which is one thing which escapes me totally is given the recent IPCC report and other various reports and absolute unanimity by the scientific community on the risks that climate change poses to the world. What I don't understand is how it can still be in certain countries a sort of a partisan issue. I mean, why renewables or the fight against climate change is perceived as a progressive cause, and is perceived by sort of the more conservative governments as sort of a myth. And I mean, I work in this every day, and I still don't get it. So I think there's still a very significant educational effort to be made because a lot of sort of the political operatives in many countries still don't believe that this is true, and they're not gonna help. They're not gonna develop policy. We saw that in Spain with the conservative government, which was completely against. I mean, climate change was a joke for them, and so I think that's something which worries me.
Either of the rest of you, Assaad or Philip, do you have any comments on this?
No.
We can if you want. But
Yeah, I'm looking at the time. So,
Gentleman here.
Quick question. Sorry, yeah. Quick question on, there are more and more information shared about the byproducts of production of windmills, like extraction of raw material that are used for windmills production, and the fact that we are just displacing the pollution from generation of carb to extraction in China of raw earth and things like that. What's your point of view? Is it another myth, or are we really talking about a real pollution problem somewhere else?
about wind?
Don't look.
Yeah, I don't think. Can you talk right into the mic? We didn't come across terribly clearly.
Okay. So the question is, to produce windmills and solar panels, we need to extract raw material that are used for magnets and things like that. And it's creating quite some pollution in China. And there are a lot of reports that are saying that we are just displacing the problem from car production to extraction problems and pollutions. Is it another myth, or is it really a real problem?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Anybody want to deal with that one?
I can try.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hate that question. Let me tell you why. So what would be your view on the 100, 200 years of dumps from the oil and gas and coal industry relative to that? Look, we need to do a little bit better with our supply chains, but this is de minimis. I mean, it doesn't even feature compared to the harm that we are going through every day today. I mean, we are destroying ecosystems at the fastest rate in history, right? For example. So I don't think the wind industry is going to contribute much to that problem, you know, on a relative basis.
Add-on question, please. Sorry, can we give this gentleman the mic? Yes.
Jürgen Schmidt, an add-on question. I buy the argument for maybe windmills. I don't know what the entropy or enthalpy is. I don't know it. But for electrifying traffic, A, it's not scalable, and B, at least in a fast pace, and B, the arsenic, cobalt, and all these materials used to build the batteries, does that really make sense? Have you thought this through? Because I heard it's a done deal. I'm not so sure at this point.
Well, look, yes, if we dump the batteries in a river stream, that's a problem. But I don't see why you could not recycle batteries and like you do for pretty much everything else. So again, I think, you know, we did a little bit more of science, which I don't have because, you know, with me at this point to really see whether or not. It depends how you deal with it. I mean, it's like normal urban waste. If you don't recycle it, it creates problem. You know, it has some of the same chemicals that you talk about. So, so I think that you need to sustainable everything, any kind of industry in a sustainable way. For solar and batteries, that means that you also need to take care about how you handle the extraction phase. And trust me, it's not about the fact that you extract noble materials, but it's how you do it. What are the standards that those companies need to follow in the countries where it's done that might create a problem? And you need to carry through the life cycle of the entire thing, and you need to do it in a sustainable way. It could be that it costs more, but this concept is, I feel always that when it comes to decarbonization, the renewable space is kept to a standard which is not the same of other industries. What do we think of the nuclear waste coming from nuclear power production, which is a significant issue? Have we put a price tag on how much does it cost to decommission 70% of power production in France from nuclear, or, you know, for future generations? So if we have to do it, and I'm in favor of doing a correct life cycle assessment, let's do it for everything. Let's do it for the oil and gas waste that he was mentioning is everywhere. let's look at the impact of the shale that is producing the extraction of natural gas. So absolutely in favor. Let's do it for everything, though.
Yeah, just let me add one point, and then we'll go on to another question, which is that the vast majority of lithium-ion batteries are being recycled. I mean, the economics of recycling lithium-ion batteries is quite attractive. I mean, it's a sort of an interesting example of where this can go. I mean, something like 85% of all the aluminum we use today is recycled. Aluminum is an expensive commodity, and it's worth recycling it. We have very effective recycling policies in place. And I think we just need to get our act together better on sort of electronics recycling than we're doing at the moment. And that could go quite some way towards mitigating this problem. It won't get rid of the problem. I think there is a problem residually, but it'll be quite a small one at that point. Gentleman somewhere over here, I tend to look to the left, but there's someone at the back who has a mic. Is that right?
The question is, given today's capacity and technology in existing supply, how long would it take to just say make everything renewable? Like, we can only make so many windmills per year, right? Like, how long would it take? And then secondly, if we were to do that, what would be the cost, say, as a percentage of global GDP or per country? I don't know if there's a study for that.
Well, I can actually answer the question for the US, because I actually wrote a paper on exactly that. It would cost about $4 trillion in terms of investment to replace all fossil fuel power plants in the US by renewable energy power plants. That's the gross cost. Now, some of those power plants would need replacing anyway because they're getting towards the end of their life. So you probably want to net off against that $4 trillion, the cost of the power plants which are going to need replacing anyway, quite independently of any decisions about transferring to renewables. And that reduces it to about $1.5 to $2 trillion. So that's roughly $60–70 billion a year for the next 15 to 20 years. And that would be enough for the US. Now, I don't know whether, does anybody happen to know the corresponding figures for the world? I don't even know that they've been worked out. A lot. Yeah. Anybody want to add anything on this question?
Two numbers. We will save $6.5 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies per annum. 5.5 trillion, sorry, which is 6.5% of global GDP. So that's on the saving side, if we did that. And two, California legislated already an answer through SB 100 by saying they're going to be 100% renewable by 2040. So 2040 is a maximum, really. You can probably get it done by 2030 if we actually all lifted our sleeves and got it done.
Yeah. Please.
I have more of a comment than a question. We in Chile have literally scanned throughout the world what different countries do in order to see whether there is anything we can learn. And we ended up very, how should I say, skeptical about what some of the countries, particularly Europe, have done about changing the energy matrix. In terms of the cost of what they have done, the institutional intensity, the subsidies and counter-subsidies that are done, that we decided to say two things. I'm from Chile, by the way. We are growing in contrast with Europe and the United States, which are basically sort of stagnant economies. We need 350 incremental megawatts every year in capacity. We cannot handle, we are incapable of handling the kinds of things that some of the countries have done. We believe that renewable energy is certainly part, if not a good part of the solution, that technological change will do the trick for us, and nothing will convince more people and companies than the economics. You are absolutely right. We have done a lot on the energy pricing. We have, how should I say, introduced green taxes, very imperfect, very primitive, because we are incapable of managing something very sophisticated, but it's better to be vaguely right than definitely wrong. And in a country, and this is not only Chile, I'm talking about emerging economies that are growing fast, where you have a large part of the population that is coming into the monetized economy, that is very hydrocarbons intensive. You are changing human toil for little machinery, tractors, etc., which are based on the combustion engine. No? There's very limited what you can do. Definitely solar energy. We have a lot of sun in our desert in the north, but it's not going to solve at all our problems of copper production, which is 1/3 of our energy demand. It's 70% of our fiscal revenue, 80% of our foreign exchange earnings. So I would say that most of the growing demand comes from developing countries, China being the first one, and unless there is a response for those economies that is simple, there is no response in the short term. There is no question that over time this will be solved. And in our case, certainly renewable has been growing, and it will continue to be growing.
Asa, you want to make any comments on that?
I'm asking for patience.
Not really.
No, okay.
I'm good with that.
Anybody else want to make any comments?
Again, I think China is the largest renewable markets in the world. I mean, the point I think is they're the most convinced about doing that. There's no question about it. And so the question is, if they were not so convinced, would they go at the same pace? I don't think so. So I go back to my original point, which is pace is about what governments do. The rest will come. Here we need to go faster. That's why we need people to be convinced and governments to set the direction.
We can take one more question, lady here. Yeah.
My question is related to capacity. So I heard there were some storage issues as well, but assuming we don't have issues around the price or regulations, in terms of renewable energy, what is actually the capacity today if we follow the IPCC report and go 100% renewable energy? How many households can be actually provided with energy? And knowing that we have 1.2 billion people who today don't have energy. So what is the global capacity that we have worldwide in terms of renewable energy? Do we know that? And if there is shortage, how much shortage do we have? How many people will not be able still to have energy tomorrow if we were to use renewables only?
Who wants to tackle that one?
Are you talking about the supply, whether the supply is limited? I think renewable energy supply is unlimited, or virtually unlimited. If we could gather the wind and solar and hydro and wave, it's a multiple of current demand and any sort of future prospective demand that you can think of. So I don't think supply is an issue at all. But I'm not sure that covers your question or not.
It's not just the supply, whether we have sun or hydro, it's really the capacity to bring the energy from a supplier, renewable company, to the citizens, basically. So it's really the transport of energy. Are we able to bring this energy, and do we have enough energy then in store to bring then this energy?
I think you need investment in transmissions, but also the world of energy production is becoming vastly decentralized. And I'll give you two figures. Italy and Germany are the most decentralized countries in the world, and I think, if I am correct, 15% is decentralized already. So yes, part of it will be in Chile, for example. You need to bring the solar from the north to the south, and you need a transmission line. But there's a lot that can also be done through decentralized generation. Some countries have done well because, again, they had the basically net metering helped for that. Others are very behind, but a lot more can be done. So it is a complex equation. You need to look at all the aspects, but neither from a technological standpoint nor from a resource standpoint, there is really a constraint. The constraint is rather, you need to have an industry that is able to attract the capital to be able to make these investments. You need an industry that needs to digitalize massively, okay? So there's a lot that is done manually in our industry that you won't even believe, and so technology is going to help quite a lot, and that's pretty much it. So you need to have an industry that is sustainable from an economic standpoint, where you have a product that can be sold to a consumer. When you reach that point, and it makes economical sense, it's going to go through.
Anybody want to have a last comment on this? Okay, great. Well, we're actually somewhat over time, so let me thank the panel very much indeed for their great comments, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.